Hey everybody, this is Jeff at contextual.io, and this is the companion video for project number 1 of the Contextual Basic Developer Training course. Today we're going to create a small web application and use it to allow a user to submit a weather report to a contextual agent that is going to store that weather report as a record in the contextual database. So a couple of different moving parts. Let's get started. The first thing we need is what is called an object type. Object types in contextual control what data you can store in the contextual platform. So if I want to be able to store that weather report, I first have to create an object type. We're going to call this one weather report. And this is for storing data. And you'll see on the left-hand side now that I have what we call a schema that defines what information that this weather report consists of. And the default schema that came up has ID, name, and description. That's cool. And if I am familiar with this language, which is called JSON schema, that's the industry standard that we use to define schemas for the contextual platform. If I'm familiar with that, I could just start editing right here. If I want to, though, or if I'm not familiar with it, I could actually use our AI assistant. And that's what I'm going to do. I've got a prompt that's already ready to go here to create a weather report schema with an auto-generated ID, an auto-generated date time, a temperature field, and a station ID property to represent the reporting weather station. So I'm going to go ahead and submit that to the AI, and I get back a schema that looks pretty good. It's got an ID, it's got the date time, it's got the temperature, the station ID. Those two are required because they have to be provided, whereas the ID and the date time are auto-generated. They're going to be automatically populated. So to accept this, I'm going to click this little icon here, which copies it back into my schema window. And then I'm going to push next. I don't need either of these features. So I'm going to go ahead and create my new object type. So now I have a weather report object type. Contextual is ready to receive data. It's ready to store records of this type. So now we need to move on to component number 2, which is a contextual flow. Flows are how we create automations in the contextual platform, and flows come in one of 2 different types. HTTP flows, which respond to incoming HTTP requests, or event flows, which process asynchronous events. We're going to cover event flows in a later video. So for today, we're going to focus on creating an HTTP flow. Why? Because we want to serve a small web form, a little web application that allows the user to submit the weather report. So let's create our flow. We're going to call this submit weather report. And go ahead and create it. Now, when you create a flow in contextual, it does not immediately launch you into the editor. And you can open up the flow editor in one of 2 ways. You can click this little icon here, or you can actually open up the flow definition and click edit flow. So now the flow editor is launching. And that'll take a few seconds to get it fully up and running. And once the flow editor has launched, what you're going to see is that there is a canvas on which we will graphically create our flow, and a palette of different nodes on the left-hand side that we will use to create the flow. In this case, we are going to create a flow that needs to, number 1, it needs to respond to an HTTP request with an HTML web form that is going to allow the user to submit this weather report. So in our case, we're going to create, we're going to serve that web form using an HTTP node, which is called an HTTP in node. So I'm going to drag that onto the canvas and double click it to open it. And it's already set up with the get method, which is what we want to support. We want to respond to an incoming GET request to a specific URL, and I'm going to call it form. Respond to GET on /form. And click done. So now I've got a node that's going to respond. It's going to allow basically that HTTP GET on the form endpoint. But now we need to figure out how to serve up the HTML. And we're going to do that with a template node. The template node is a way of dynamically populating data into a property of what is called your message. Message in a flow, or MSG, the message in a flow is the data object that is passed from one node to the next to the next. And each node has the ability, depending on what node you use, to modify the properties of message. In this case, a template node by default is going to store information or data into message.payload. So this is where we're going to define our HTML. And I've already got the HTML for this little web app ready. So I'm just going to paste it in to this node, okay? And change the highlighting to HTML because this is HTML. I actually generated this little HTML form with the HTML and JavaScript using ChatGPT. If you go to our documentation site for our training projects, go to Project One, you'll actually see that I provide both the HTML and the prompt that I used with ChatGPT in order to create this HTML. So anybody could have done this. So we've got our HTML, and you'll see if we look at the HTML that it's building up a little payload of data, an object that contains temperature and station ID, which happen to be the exact same properties that we created in our weather report object type. So that's good because these names need to match in order for this to work. This HTML is also going to do a post to an endpoint called submit, which we need to create, and we're going to do that next. So I'm going to go ahead and click done, and you see that I also wired these two nodes together. I connected the output of the HTTP in node to the input of the template node. So now we've got our get on /form. We've got the HTML that is going into message.payload. Now we just need to return it to the browser. And we're going to do that by using the HTTP response node, which is here. And HTTP response is a very simple node. It simply takes whatever is in message.payload, returns it as the response to the HTTP request, and sets the status code to whatever you tell it to. So in this case, a 200 for an HTTP request means everything worked. Everything's okay. So we're going to set that as our status code. And so now we've done the first part. We've responded to the HTTP GET on the /form endpoint with our HTML and JavaScript. Now we need to move on to the next step, which is that submit endpoint that you saw, that the JavaScript is going to be submitting the form results to the /submit endpoint. So we're going to create another HTTP node. This one is going to respond to a post to /submit submit form, and so that's our first node. But what are we going to do now with the data? The data coming from this submit node, from this HTTP node, is going to be in message.payload. And so what we're going to do with that is to use a create object node, wire it up, double click on it to open it, and we're going to say, well, this is our create weather report, because that's what we're going to do with this. We're going to create a weather report from the information that we receive in message.payload. That's literally all you need to do to create the record in the contextual database, right? So now we've accepted the form, we're creating the weather report, and now just like before, we're going to respond with an OK. I'm actually going to copy and paste the OK node or the HTTP response node and wire it in. Done. So now we've got all the components that we need for this little web app. Notice that there's nothing in here yet about error handling, and that's because we're going to talk about that in the next video. Project number 2 is where we're going to look at error handling and debugging. So for now, we're just going to assume that everything is going to work correctly. We're going to push save, and we're going to go back to the contextual console and move on to step number 3 here, which is to create our agent. That's important because when you create a flow, although you can debug the flow in the editor itself and do some testing, and we're going to, again, do that in the next video, it's not deployed, it's not running until you create an agent to deploy that flow. So that's what we're going to do now, is to create an agent, and we will also call this submit weather report, submit weather report agent. We'll just put that in the description as well. And the type is an HTTP to flow agent. Remember, I mentioned that there are 2 types. We'll talk about the other type in a later video. We're going to use our submit weather report flow. You should always use the latest image version that is available here. In this case, it's 3.12.1. And we're going to use a small instance of an agent. We don't need a lot of compute power for this particular agent, so a small is good enough. And we're going to push create. And now we're going to click back into the agent and look at the operations tab, and you'll see that its status is pending. It's not yet fully up and running. And so we need to wait until it is before we try to test it. So we're going to refresh here a couple of times and wait for it to go, for the status to show as running. And once it does, now it's up and running. Now you'll notice that we only have 1 agent instance. In our paid plans, in the free plan, you are limited to 1 agent instance. In our paid plans, you can have as many agent instances as you want or need in order to handle the scale of your particular use case. And now it says running. So now we'll go back to definition, and we're going to copy the URL for this agent, because that's how we're going to access this agent in a browser, is by opening another tab, pasting in the URL for that agent, but now adding on to it /form, because that's remember, that's the URL or the path that we used for our HTTP GET node that is going to respond to this browser doing an HTTP GET on that particular endpoint, and it does. So now you can see that we've got our weather report form that is going to allow me to submit a weather report. So I'm going to type in 25 degrees, and the station ID is Jeff, and I'm going to push submit. And there we go. Weather report submitted successfully. And if I go back over here to the contextual console and go to records, data, this is where, again, I'll see all my object types, but now it's not for editing the object type, it's for seeing the data for that object type. So if I click on weather report, I will see that I have 1 record in the database. It has our auto-generated ID. It's got the date time. It's got the temperature and the station ID. So everything that I expected to be there is there. I can click on the record and see it in a form, or I can look at the JSON for this particular record as well. So we've now succeeded in what was required for this project, which, to just recap, required that we created an object type called a weather report. It required that we created a flow called submit weather report. That flow had two different HTTP operations that it responded to. The first was the GET to serve up the HTML and the JavaScript, and the second was the POST to allow the application to submit the form. And then finally, we deployed that flow as an agent. So we've touched on really the big three of contextual components. These are the components that you are always going to use when building solutions with contextual. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you in the next video.